This is a bit of a departure from what I usually do on this channel, but I hope you will be willing to indulge me. It is well known to many of you that I am a fan of Marilyn Manson.
Dude, fuck yeah! Manson was the shit back in the 90s, yo!
Actually, I like his more recent stuff better.
Dude, what? I mean, like, he's okay now or whatever, but back in the 90s, man, he was the fucking Antichrist. He was the Antichrist, dude. He was like all skinny and pale and wearing like weird corsets and shit. It was fucking awesome.
Sure, it cannot be denied that Manson was at the peak of his notoriety during the mid to late 90s when he set himself up in pop culture as the Antichrist superstar, a symbol of satanic power who hung his hat somewhere between Kiss and Friedrich Nietzsche. For the uninitiated, Manson's most famous albums form what Manson has called his triptych. A triptych is a work of art, usually a panel painting, that is divided into 3 sections or 3 carved panels that are hinged together and can be folded. Obviously, Manson's albums don't fit this definition in the strictest sense, so he's using the word more metaphorically. The albums that comprise Manson's triptych are Antichrist Superstar, Mechanical Animals, and Hollywood. And if you talk to most Manson fans, the chances that one of these 3 albums will be their favorite is pretty fucking high. In fact, even I would have to say that Hollywood is probably ultimately my favorite standalone Manson album. But Manson's most famous triptych is not even my favorite trilogy of Manson albums. That honor would have to go to his 3 most recent albums, The High End of Low, Born Villain, and The Pale Emperor. And by the way, The Pale Emperor is, in my opinion, a sister album with Antichrist Superstar. I'll get more into that later. Alright, so if anyone is to have any idea what the hell I'm talking about, we have to do a brief overview of Manson's musical output since the inception of his band. I'll cover this as quickly as possible, focusing on only the aspects of these albums that are pertinent to the argument at hand. This is Brian Warner in the late 80s. He works as a journalist for a South Florida lifestyle magazine called The 25th Parallel, where he writes primarily about music. But he harbors within him a disgust for the music he writes about. He feels like the vast majority of it is insipid, uninspired drivel. He begins to question, why am I writing about these people? I should be the one being written about. In 1989, Brian transformed himself into Marilyn Manson, the eponymous lead singer of Marilyn Manson and the Spooky Kids. The band gained a reputation in the Florida music scene as a dark, theatrical, experimental, industrial powerhouse whose stage show and promotional imagery juxtaposed Saturday morning cartoons and Dr. Seuss with the macabre and the satanic. According to SpookyKids.net, even Manson's harshest critics have always had to admit he was a master of self-promotion. When other bands were out partying, Manson was at Kinko's at 4 in the morning printing flyers for the next week's show. He started a Spooky Kids hotline where he encouraged his fans to call and leave deranged messages, and sent out regular newsletters to his growing legion of fans. Manson was such an excellent self-promoter, in fact, that the first article published about Marilyn Manson was written by Brian Warner, before the band had even played their first show. The drive, determination, organization, and imagination of Manson led to his being noticed by Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails fame in 1991 and being signed to Reznor's then nascent and now defunct vanity label Nothing Records in 1993. It was at this point that Marilyn Manson and the Spooky Kids became simply Marilyn Manson. In 1994, Manson released his first studio album, Portrait of an American Family. The album is a lot more schlocky and less serious-minded than most of Manson's library, and some consider it little more than a practice album before Manson was fully realized in Antichrist Superstar. I am not so quick to write off the album. Yes, it is cheesy, but it makes good points and it entertains you in the process, much like the movie They Live. I don't really view Portrait as a practice album before things really got going in Antichrist Superstar. Rather, I view it as the fulfillment of what the Spooky Kids always were, a goth-industrial hybrid that juxtaposes criticisms of American life with satanic imagery and over-the-top cartoon cheesiness. The band's next effort was an EP called Smells Like Children, which is kind of fun, but mostly only notable for featuring Manson's iconic cover of the Eurythmics' Sweet Dreams, a song that truly catapulted Manson into the mainstream. The follow-up to Smells Like Children was the famous Antichrist Superstar, released in 1996. Gone was the cheesiness of Manson's prior efforts. The dark imagery was cranked up, the heavy industrial sound was brought to center stage, and Manson himself began to look less like a frontman to a band and more like an emaciated demon from the depths of hell. Antichrist Superstar also represents the beginning of Manson's love affair with the concept album. The album tells a story of a weak and submissive character called the Worm, who, through a series of trials and tribulations, becomes the Antichrist, a powerful figure of resolve and confidence. The next album, 1998's Mechanical Animals, was a total departure from Antichrist Superstar, and this is where Manson fans really started to split. Manson did not evolve slowly over time from grinding industrial rock to melodic glam rock. He made the transition suddenly and abrasively in less than 2 years. At the time, Manson explained his transition by saying that Antichrist Superstar was about a man stripping himself of all emotions, and Mechanical Animals was about what happens when those emotions come back. It, too, is a heavy concept album whose story seems to revolve around an alien being called Omega, who comes to Earth only to be exploited by a conniving entertainment industry. It's easy to see how Manson would have related this story to himself. It's also very similar to David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust. After Mechanical Animals came 2000's Hollywood. This album marks a beginning in the decline of the commercial success of the band, but I don't think it marks a decline in the quality of their output. Once again, we have a concept album, this time about a character named Adam, who seeks fame and fortune to escape the mundanity of his existence, only to discover that when he has achieved these things, he is in the very company of those who had held him down his entire life. He becomes vindictive and strikes back at them. It is also during this time that Manson starts talking about the triptych formed by Antichrist Superstar, Mechanical Animals, and Hollywood. But now it seems his interpretation has changed. Rather than viewing Mechanical Animals as a sequel to Antichrist Superstar, he now views the albums as a story told in reverse. In other words, Hollywood is the beginning of the story, Mechanical Animals is part 2, and Antichrist Superstar is the finale. These are, as we discussed earlier, the 3 albums that the vast majority of Manson fans will hold up as the pinnacle of Marilyn Manson. In 2003, Manson released The Golden Age of Grotesque. It, too, was a concept album, but it seems far less interested in telling the story of a character than it does capturing the feeling of a time and place. Manson is at this point frustrated with his career because he has accomplished everything that he set out to do. He had become a rock star, he had infiltrated the mainstream with a level of subversion that we still haven't seen again to this very day. He had explored every facet of the central ideas that he started with, so he began to embrace the spirit of vaudeville and the Dada movement and burlesque. In other words, he made an album designed solely to entertain and provoke an audience. This is Marilyn Manson's vision of a crowd pleaser. Not done because he wanted big hits and success, but done because, as he states in the song, "This is the new shit, everything has been said before, nothing left to say anymore." These lyrics, according to Manson, are the first things written for the album. It's sort of a scary place to begin a new artistic endeavor by admitting to yourself that your bag of tricks is essentially empty, and you're not even sure what you can say that you haven't already said. Does the album work? My answer is yes, though it probably doesn't work as well as Manson imagined it would. It wouldn't be until 2007, a full 4 years later, that we would hear new music from Marilyn Manson. This was highly unusual because up until that point, Manson had been putting out albums roughly every 2 years since his arrival on the scene. Eat Me, Drink Me is a radical departure from the usual Manson style. First, the music totally sounds different than anything Manson's ever done before, but more importantly, this was not a concept album. This was more of a confessional album from a Manson who is tired of being grandiose characters and singing entirely in metaphor. This is a Manson who is desperately trying to show us his humanity. And it kind of sucks. I mean, it was well received by critics, and I've heard some people claim that it's their favorite Manson album, but to me, it's the worst thing he's ever put out. And it's not because I couldn't let go of the past and see that there's more to Manson than concept albums. It's just that it's not really that good. And let me be clear, the worst Manson album is still better than 99% of all albums ever released, in my opinion. I mean, okay, it's got some good tracks, but it never coheres into anything substantial. It just boils down to a lot of wailing and caterwauling about the various ignominies and worriments of Marilyn Manson, who is clearly depressed, and who clearly still can't think of much to say. Then in 2009 came The High End of Low, which for my money is the most underrated Marilyn Manson album ever released. This is what Eat Me, Drink Me should have been. Here is where Manson begins to bridge the gap between the more personal, confessional style that he had began to affect in Eat Me, Drink Me, and the more conceptual, metaphorical style of his 90s output. The album is about love and anger and frustration, and the title really does reflect well what the album is. This is about a man who has been lost in a fog for years and is only now beginning to emerge. If Hollywood marks the end of the classic Manson era, and Golden Age represents, we'll say, a stumble, and Eat Me, Drink Me represents a fall, then this album, to me, represents the process of standing back up and knocking the dust off your pants. In 2012 came Born Villain, and I think I'll let Manson himself explain that one. In an interview with Loudwire, Manson stated, "It took me completely stripping my life away, moving into a place with black floors and white walls, putting all my things in storage, and just taking my movies, my instruments, my cats, and realizing I don't need anything else. All I need to do is fill this room full of something. I'm trying to take things back to the beginning. I was not calculating that way. I simply needed to realize that this is life. I needed to realize what I wanted out of life. I suddenly realized that I was the one who sat and drew my first flyer. I went to Kinko's, I printed it out, I put it on cars, myself, personally, and I didn't even have any songs at the time." This is Manson asking himself, why did I stumble? Why did I fall? Where have I been since 2000? For a decade, I haven't been who I'm supposed to be. The album itself is about what it means to be a villain. Is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it society that deems you a villain? Or is it you that declares yourself a villain? Manson stated in an interview with CNN, "In any story, the villain is the catalyst. The hero's not a person who will bend the rules or show the cracks in his armor. He's one-dimensional intentionally. But the villain is the person who owns up to what he is and stands by it. He'll do the things that are sometimes morally questionable, but he does it because it's his nature to do it, and it doesn't fluctuate." But more than villainy, I think this album is about a man trying to rediscover his power, realizing that he has strayed from what he was, perhaps tried to defy his villainous nature by becoming too humanized and sympathetic. I think that this is Manson telling us, I tried to show you my vulnerability, and every good villain has a sympathetic side, but at the end of the day, I am the villain. I'm here to rattle cages, I'm here to be the catalyst for something new, and I will not be content in becoming a one-dimensional hero. And that finally brings us to Manson's most recent work, 2015's The Pale Emperor. Several reviewers have claimed that this is Manson's best album in over a decade, and I think that they're both right and wrong about that. Because The Pale Emperor is about a man who has rediscovered his passions. has fully emerged from the mire of his personal life, who has fully escaped the fog of his own weariness. And he finally has discovered once again what he wants to say. To quote the Rolling Stone review of the album, lyrically, Manson plays with all the old themes: power, torture, drugs, sex and violence, dependency and emptiness. But the artist, who once called himself a hand grenade that never stopped exploding, is more focused. What I find interesting is that as a man in his 20s and early 30s, Manson made a trilogy of concept albums about a defeated, insignificant figure who suffers through trials and tribulations to become a more powerful being. He told this story through a series of characters: the worm who becomes the Antichrist, the alien Omega who becomes a product, a piece of mass merchandise, the boy named Adam who escapes his shitty life only to discover that he is now breaking bread with those who once shit on him. The central theme of all these concept albums, when you put them together, is the feeling of being lowly and then rising up from that station and achieving something great, all while flipping off those who held you down and burning down everything they care about. Because in an evil society, a villain is a hero, because only a villain can speak the truth. But as a man passing from his 30s into his 40s, Manson created a trilogy of albums that did more than conceptualize this rise from pain and depression to power and prestige. He actually lived it. That's why The Pale Emperor is a sister album of Antichrist Superstar. The transformation that Antichrist Superstar described metaphorically is actually realized in The Pale Emperor. And it's not realized through a character or a concept, it's realized by Manson himself. So what Antichrist Superstar, Mechanical Animals, and Hollywood showed us through metaphor and allegory, High End of Low, Born Villain, and The Pale Emperor show us through experience. That, to me, is more powerful. So when you say, back in the 90s, Manson was the Antichrist, he was the Antichrist, my response is no. In the 90s, he was just playing the Antichrist. It wasn't until 2015 that he actually became the Antichrist. And I truly believe that you cannot look at High End of Low, Born Villain, and The Pale Emperor as separate works. You have to see them as a journey, as a new triptych, a new rise to power, because this is a journey that Manson has had to take twice in his life. Once he had to take that journey from Brian Warner to Marilyn Manson. Then, when Marilyn Manson became deflated by a lack of inspiration and a slew of relationship issues and personal dramas, Manson had to look around with an honest eye and realize that, in a way, he was back where he started. He was Marilyn Manson still, but Marilyn Manson had lost much of its meaning. It was no longer a symbol of power, but an obsolete relic of the past. The new triptych is about righting every single one of those wrongs and seizing back what was lost, not just as a performer, but as a person.
Yeah, dude, but in the 90s, he fucking was the Antichrist. It was fucking awesome!